This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. Well, this May Bank holiday weekend, from Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 5th of May, Books for Breakfast are heading to Strokestown International Poetry Festival. We're really looking forward to the opening night, actually, on Friday at 7:30. We'll be listening to Roscommon writers read, Jerry Boland, Louise C. Coyle, Jessamine O'Connor and Michael O'Dea, and straight after that in the cafe in Strokestown House at 9 p.m. it'll be Rita Ann Higgins reading. All are very welcome and we'd love to see you all there. It's going to be fun, isn't it, Peter? Saturday, Sunday, events galore. Peter, what kind of events are you looking forward to?
There's quite a lot. I mean, it is a pretty packed programme. I'm just looking at it now. I mean, there's a film screening, Learning Gravity, The Undertaker, which is about the work. Cathal Black made a film about the American poet Thomas Lynch. There's a bilingual reading with Celia Dufresne and Ethne Gallagher. There's Washing Windows 5, Irish Women Write Poetry, with readings of new poems by Liz McManus, Jackie Lynham, Phil Herbert, Shauna Gilligan. There's a book launch. Tony Curtis, not Irish Tony Curtis, but Tony Curtis from Wales, and Ger Reedy will present new work. And then there's a poetry reading by Patrick Deely and a certain Enda Wiley, and that's at 5 p.m. And also Jane Clark and Mary O'Donnell will be reading.
Right, sounds like a really packed event. And also, of course, you'll be introducing the bilingual reading event. Good on you, Peter. And I'm looking forward to reading with Patrick Deely, who we'll be hearing from later, and also Tony Curtis. Also, Sunday is looking good. There's going to be the annual launch of Cyphers 96. And I've heard that poet Eleni Quillinan is already packing up her new editions of Cyphers to bring down to that. It's always a very nice event. And I was really lucky, I think, to read all the poems for the Strokestown International Poetry Festival competition, and I'll be announcing the winner at 2 p.m. on Sunday the 5th of May if anyone wants to come along. I think it's great as well, Peter, that this festival, as you said, it's got poetry films, it's got poets, but it also has a lecture by novelist and festival curator Belinda McKeown. She's delivering the Joan McBreen lecture on poetry, and it's called Striding Over Enjambment and the Pandemic Poem. I'd be interested to go along to that. There are other book launches later on Sunday, Peter. Can you tell us about them?
Well, there's Ava Burke, Geraldine Mills and Joseph Woods, also the director, of course, and he's going to be reading from his new, they're all going to be reading from new books there as well. And I'm reading myself with Elaine at 7:15 on Sunday night. And then at 9 p.m, Brilliant Mysteries, Music and Poetry with Duke's Special and James Harper, which sounds very promising as well.
Yeah, and of course that's Eleni Quillinan and Peter Sirr reading in the evening of Sunday. I think it's good as well that there'll be a lot of music happening as well. It's always good because music and poetry go hand in hand, as we know. Of course, Peter, it's also worth noting, isn't it, that this year marks 25 years since the foundation of the Strokestown Poetry Festival in Roscommon. And the festival was originally established by Marilee Harper. She was a UK native who settled herself happily in Roscommon for many years and built a thriving poetry festival over the years, the core of it being the prestigious International Poetry Prize that brought shortlisted poets from all over the world to read their work alongside the established invited poets. And festival directors who came after Marilee included poets Paddy Bush, Peter Sirr, sitting beside me here, Martin Dyer, and Melissa Newman, a resident of Strokestown, was also a fantastic festival director. And of course, currently the director of the festival is poet Joe Woods. And we're going to hear now, why does he like directing this festival?
Kind of running Strokestown is, it's kind of a second nature thing. And it's a lovely way to be connected back into the world of the arts. So yeah, it's very much a case of being connected and kind of being back in that community again. And the wonderful thing about having a festival is that, when you encounter poets and you lift up books and you encounter new voices and stuff, you can suddenly say, oh, that might be somebody for the festival. And, it builds up that way. So it's a kind of a year-round passion.
And of course, Joseph Woods is not just the director of the Strokestown International Poetry Festival, he's also a poet in his own right. So we thought we'd talk to him about his new book of poems just out from Daedalus Press, which will be launched at the festival.
It's your fifth collection, and it continues a kind of travel conversation begun in previous books. I was thinking most recently, like your last one, Monsoon Diaries, which came out in 2018, and that took us on journeys to Myanmar, where you lived at the time, Zimbabwe, back to your native Ireland. And this new book has us kind of more firmly settled as readers in Harare in Zimbabwe. And it's a book with lots of tensions. I mean, there's we're aware of the danger of an imminent coup d'etat in Zimbabwe. There's cholera, there's COVID. There's also the tension of the natural world. The cyclone Shalene, for instance, in the poem Fireflies. You quote from Doris Lessing at the start of the book, where she writes of the season of wildfires. What are the season of wildfires, which had a climate of its own? Lowering, smoking horizons, the yellow thickness of the middle air, the black wastes of veld. It was an extra season inserted into the natural year, she said. This balancing, if you like, of the natural world and a tense political world that you found yourself in Harare. Did that kind of, it must have inspired you in some ways as a poet?
Well-travelled as I was, I remember saying to somebody, I'll go to Africa in the next life. And suddenly I found myself, aged 49, with family kind of arriving in Africa, and suddenly all these kind of vistas opening up, and there was huge sense of material, and a huge but also kind of arriving in Harare at the time, there was a kind of sense too of, it was a sense of stasis in a sense, because it was the end of Mugabe's regime. So there was we had almost 2 years there of the latter end of that time. And it was very interesting. It was a very interesting time to observe. And it was, I suppose as well is I was also connecting with that kind of expatriated life, of you mentioned Doris Lessing, and she's a very good cipher for when I was there for observing, and I just was witnessing material and content.
Well, you're going to read a poem for us now, Joe, which gives us very much a sense of the exotic world that you encountered in your lifetime in Zimbabwe when you were there. And we'd love to hear it now.
Lots of people used to say, oh, did you go on safaris? But for some reason, safaris are always called game drives. So it's, I suppose, kind of a safari. And it's just to locate it, it's on the edge of Lake Kariba, and in a place called Macedonia. And it's an incredible place. But my daughter at the time, game drives can be quite exhausting and quite long. And I'll read the poem. Game drive. Our daughter grows bored on the game drive. We've been out all day in a jeep, and my bird list bolsters while the sun seems to grow, shifting to setting mode. So many hippos gathered on the water's edge, common as beetles, and even beetle-like in the distance. And the woolly-necked stork, who has just descended, has been renamed a stinky-necked stork after the close-up of the ghoulish marabou earlier this morning. And elephants, numerous as sheep on your uncle's farm last Christmas. And then one silhouette of a truly enormous specimen, like something from that movie you've watched over and over. You are hungry now and longing for the fish you caught this morning, your first ever, one on each line of your first 6 casts. And just as we are turning from the water's edge, the adults, unfairly fortified with gin, we see 2 lionesses on a slope facing the sun, like our own cats back in Harare. Mercifully, for our daughter at least, a zebra kill has been concealed behind bushes, while a lion cub pokes its head out to gawk at us. Complete and speedily home now through long shadows of bushveld, we have the lake to cross to our island named after a kind of goose, in an open boat, the sky turned navy and the lights of old approaching, while avoiding poles of dead trees spectrally rising from the water, when she shouts, "Look, look, over there, a rabbit."
Oh, very evocative poem, Joe. Great that you read it there. It's a collection that I have to say Peter and I have thoroughly been enjoying, so congratulations. And the strength of these new poems seem to lie not just in the physical journeying of you, the poet, but rather in the heartfelt discoveries you make. It's kind of your own personal narrative unfolding. Far off in Harare, away from Ireland, you begin to look back to home, to think about your father's death, an uncle, your sister's house in Meath, an old Black Ford prefect rusting in your grandparents' paddock in Longford. You remember Irish poets as well, like Austin Clarke or Evan Boland. And there's a lovely poem, Fire-Necked Nightjar, which you wrote in memory of your friend, the poet MacDara Woods. So there's kind of a toing and froing, isn't there, between both places, Ireland and Zimbabwe. And in a poem, Wheat Ear, you're back in Ireland on Lamb's Head in Derrynane Kerry, and a wheat-ear bird soon to return to southern Africa reminds you it is time to turn our prows south and head for home. And in another poem, Let's Get Lost, you reach for your wife's hand hoping we will never settle. And it kind of made me think of Henry Miller, who once wrote of travel that one's destination is never a place, but it's a new way of seeing things. And I was wondering, do you feel this way too about travel and poetry?
Yeah, it very much the case, because, as you said there, and it's like there's always this kind of diastole between home and elsewhere, or where you are. You're constantly toing and froing, and I suppose constantly. That's obviously your reference point, and there's a few points in this book where I'm really kind of querying what home is, what it's turned out to be. And it's funny that you mentioned the Wheat Ear poem, because that was when, after quite a long period in Ireland, because of during the pandemic, and we were finally kind of going back in a sense, and there was a sense of there is home, in a very weird sort of way, and at the same time being in this kind of wonderful, idyllic kind of place that we love, and at the same time kind of pointing the prow of the ship back, So yeah, it's a kind of it's a constant thing, and it is a new way of seeing, one very simple thing is that I often say I'm a kind of a failed zoologist, because that's what I really wanted to be. And the funny thing was that arriving or turning up in Africa, I suddenly rekindled my massive kind of interest in birds, and I became a bird watcher again. And I kind of think I always knew I would. I would I would go back to it, and suddenly, I think there were 36 species of birds in our garden, and there was just this sudden, kind of reconnection with the past that was brought on, and there's these constant kind of toing and froing, and also sometimes creating new pictures and new senses as well.
You've dedicated Veiled Fires to your wife Sarah and daughter Eliza, and obviously you all travelled and lived in Zimbabwe as your wife's work brought you there as a family. And at the heart of the book, I mean, there's also this kind of the joy in your growing daughter and the life that you're kind of building there. And there's lots of wonderful short poems dotted throughout the book, where we see your young daughter becoming like a bit of a philosopher, an observer of the world as well. There's the poem like in Bulawayo train station, dried up oil on a deserted platform, makes her say, I know a gate in Burma that could do with that. Or in cave paintings, she says the lines on her belly look like cave paintings. Mm-hmm. So I suppose, I mean, is that part of it? That kind of the familial life and the domestic life are obviously part of what kind of gets you going as a poet as well.
Well, absolutely. And, for you mentioned MacDara Woods earlier, and I remember MacDara Woods saying to me once, he said, the great thing about, and this is when I didn't have a child, he said, the great thing about having a child is it makes you look at the world differently and for a second time. He said, you get to look at the world, twice round, and that came into my head recently, because the great thing about Eliza was the sense that in a way I was looking at things for the first time, but also you're looking at this kind of magical, like you're also looking at a kind of a topography for the first time. It's a bit like, I grew up watching survival documentaries on Africa, thinking I'd never go there, I'd never be there, and then suddenly you are there, but you're there with a kind of a young child. So it was extraordinary. And when you mentioned cave paintings, that short poem, there was a sense too that Eliza, because there's a lot of cave paintings in Zimbabwe, and Eliza's sense of topography had become African. Like one day she said, we must take the dogs to Mozambique. And I said, well, why would we take them to Mozambique? And she said, well, they'd love the beach, they'd love the sea. And I thought it was the most extraordinary thing, because Mozambique meant the sea to Eliza. Yeah, because Zimbabwe is landlocked, and it's just her sense of kind of a topography, of an African topography almost.
Okay, and Joe, you're going to read us a poem on a kind of different subject. It's a poem called 3, which recalls your father's death. Yeah,
and this is a throwback in a sense, a much kind of earlier poem, and it's actually. Not that it matters, but it's kind of set in Burma, because there's mention of a mosquito net. 3. Me and my recently 3-year-old daughter having horseplay on the bed under the dome of a mosquito net, when inevitably we bash our heads and there's tears. I go get ice, direct its glide across her temple, kiss to make it better, but smart at her cold flesh. 3 days after she came into this world, I kissed my father's marble forehead.
And that was Joe Woods reading a really beautiful poem called 3 from his new collection, Veld Fires. Elaine Quilnon has said of Joe's work, his voice is easy, melodic, seeming sometimes casual, sometimes deceptively smooth, but always alert. If Woods is technically expert, it is not to dazzle, but to reveal his subject matter. His work taken as a whole shows an impressive reach and range, so high praise indeed. And Peter and I wholeheartedly recommend Joe Woods' striking new collection, Veld Fires, to all you readers out there.
Another poet reading at the festival is Ava Burke, whose 8th collection of poems, Tattoos, has just been launched by Daedalus Press. A collection which deals with bereavement, heartbreak, and, ultimately, renewal. And the poem she's chosen to read here is called Jammertal.
This poem is called Jammertal, which means Valley of Tears. And it has an epigraph, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen, by Friedrich Rückert, a poem that was put to music by Gustav Mahler and sung by Kathleen Ferrier, beautiful alto Kathleen Ferrier. It is in memory of my brother Gerhard, who died in his 40s on a summer day in Munich after returning from work. And I found him in his room. He will always be young, my older brother. I am long past the age he was the day he died, when his heart had struggled too hard against its sad weariness and gave in. When I looked for him and found him alone in his room with the sun and the dust motes dancing indifferently above him. When the police and the doctor came, when he was loved by us and many more, his students, his musician friends, his car mechanic, his tax accountant, and even the middle-aged woman at the checkout who was devoted to him. When he was sovereign of the floating moment, when he set his wristwatch to his own remote time zone, as inaccessible as outer space, when he composed divertimenti for street noise and starlings, when the linden trees at his window unstoppered their perfumes for him in June nights, when the world's most beautiful alto, Janet Baker, carried him off to the land of summer moons, when he wrote poems in microscopic script on stamp-sized paper, miniature time machines that ticked and chimed, when his brief, cryptic messages were the wit of the soul, when he was king of the smoke rings that rose and were transubstantiated into revelations, a daily miracle in his kingdom. When he was as free and easy as the ash tree in the park, the tree that housed insects, crows and the stars, in whose shadow old men played the world's slowest chess games. When he became lost to the world more and more, when he slept with his head on his radio and the sorrow of Bruckner in his ear, when he was told in his dreams what music is, when he came home from work, unspeakably tired that day, when he lay down to take a short rest that lasted forever, when I found him, and my first thought was that he had hurried ahead without waiting for me, while death tinkered with his stopwatch. When the emergency team, the doctor and the police arrived in force, when they trooped into his room with their paper authority, their instruments and official stamps, and their minds made up. When we stood in the hall, unable to speak or move, when they closed the door and shut us out, when they went to work in there purposefully as frost, when they carried him out in a plastic sack, when his t-shirt and jeans lay on the floor, cut in half.
That was wonderful hearing Ava Burke read her beautiful poem Yammertal there. And as she says in another poem, The Singer's Fable, sing even if your hearts are heavy, even if your houses are on fire, rise up and sing. Well, another poet who's definitely singing is the poet Patrick Deeley in his new book, Keepsake, just published by Daedalus Press. And here we have him reading his poem, Nobodies, from this collection.
This is a poem called Nobodies, from my new collection, Keepsake. The poem examines the notion of life as real and tangible, and also possessed of an aura of ghostliness that runs alongside it or seems an inherent part of it. Nobodies. Whether we work with pens or guns, shovels or brooms, or stare at flickering screens in air-conditioned rooms, or hang for hours on telephone lines, or cope with big diseases that sound definite and purposeful, each its own answer, its withering solution to resources we exhaust. And even if we throw dizzying, plume-looped aerobatics across the sky, or hold the high sea with the bravura of Pavarotti in his heyday, this business of being nobodies overtakes us. The abundant, open-ended world, a vast nothingness. The trees and waterfalls whispering ghosts in ghostly breezes, our firm friends and faithful lovers found to be insubstantial. See them now, grown forgetful of how they are undone by the dream that animates them. See ourselves given to the gift of the moment as we savour the salt trickle of their tears. Inhale the animal musk, still pirouetting on their skin.
Well, that was great hearing Patrick Deeley there read his poem Nobodies from his collection Keepsake, just out from Daedalus. And Tom McCarthy said of Patrick Deeley, he's a poet, a true poet actually, whose work will survive as a crowning privilege in our generation. It's a great quote indeed. So next up we have Tony Curtis, not the Irish Tony Curtis as Peter said earlier, but the Welsh poet Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was born in Carmarthen in Wales, and he grew up there and in Pembrokeshire, where his grandmother's family had lived for hundreds of years. Tony has written and edited over 40 books, most recently his first novel, Darkness in the City of Light, and an anthology of poems for the Tí Havan Children's Charity, where the birds sing our names. He has won many awards for his work, and his most recent book, his first poetry collection since From the Fortunate Isles, New and Selected Poems, is Leaving the Hills, published by Sirr this year.
It's a notably wide-ranging collection. The poems are set in lots of different places: California, Carmarthen, medieval Ireland to present-day Wales. There's also a range of styles: lyrical poems, longer dramatic monologues, and likewise a range of subjects. Aldous Huxley and his wife leaving the Hollywood Hills in the title poem, as a wildfire destroys the area, Roger Bannister, Muhammad Ali, Billie Holiday, Claude Debussy. There's a moving sequence written for the 50th anniversary of the Aberfan disaster in response to the photographs of Chuck Rappaport.
Yeah, and actually that's my first question, Tony. You're obviously a very productive poet. Do you find poetry everywhere, or are there specific triggers for you?
I may find it everywhere. I'm not looking for it. I think at my age and 11 collections in, I don't look for it anymore. Nobody's waiting for a Tony Curtis poem. But maybe the poems are waiting for me. One of the poems that in the book, which is set in Ireland, which Peter is going to read for me in a moment, is based on a photographer, Peter Lavery. We stayed with Peter Lavery in Wiltshire last week, who just happens to have a farm with a Roman kiln on it that's being excavated at the moment. Now, I didn't know I was going to go there and write a poem, and it's so corny as a guest of someone to write a poem for them. But in fact, I'm writing it for me because so many interesting things happened on that journey. We went through Wootton Bassett, the little town where all the British Army dead were flown back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And then to come across one of the major Roman kilns for the whole of England, that conjunction of empires and civilizations in various forms, things. You read a lot of things, and poems come to you. They demand to be written, really.
Yeah, I like that idea of poems demanding to be written. I've noticed too, there's a few poems about Ireland. I mean, there's a poem, for instance, about the Irish poet Michael Longley. There's a poet about Geraldus Cambrensis in Ireland. He's somewhat notorious in Ireland, Tony, it has to be said.
Yeah. I know Gerald of Wales, who was born in what became my native Pembrokeshire, went to Ireland to investigate the spiritual state of these almost heathen people, and he was very insulting about Ireland. It's very tongue in cheek. I do not subscribe. I am not of the Gerald of Wales party, let me tell you. But he found. He found all kinds of odd things in Ireland, and the poem is called of barnacles of barnacles, geese, and other wonders. And he discovered that the Irish would avoid giving up meat for Lent by eating goose because they thought that geese came from goose barnacles and therefore were related to fish, and therefore they were allowed to eat them. I mean, I think it's a wonderfully ingenious and marvelously humorous Irish way of getting their way out of a problem. But Gerald was very serious about this. I mean, he was a bit of a fool.
The one good thing he had to say about the Irish was he liked the music. He was very complimentary about the Irish ability at music.
Really, it's about someone going to a country as I am in Ireland at the moment and completely misunderstanding it.
One of the poems that's interesting is it has an Irish kind of connection as well. It's called Caroline Gerbilla on Conchita, and it's based on a striking photograph of a girl on a horse by Peter Lavery, the award-winning photographer who specialised in kind of photographing circus people. I wonder if you might tell us a bit about how this came about. The photograph, I should say, is also in the book beside the poem.
Yes, it is, and there are several photographs in this book. I'm very anxious to. I'm very keen to have visual stimuli alongside of the words. Well, as I say, I visited and met Peter Lavery for the first time last week and came across this astonishing and long sequence of circus studies, which he started when he was a student. I mean, I'm 77, he's 77. He's been doing it since his art college days. So he's been photographing circus people for a long time. And they're wonderful evocations of a very particular sort of life. And I like that maybe under threat actually now. They have a nice period feel to them. And Caroline Gerbola on Conchita is photographed in a back lane in Tralee almost 50 years ago. And I'd be delighted if you would read it in your inimitable way, Peter.
Sure, I'd read it, yeah. Okay, so it's Caroline Gerbola on Conchita. Pod comes running to our gang and says, Seamus is catching something amazing in the yard at the back of O'Leary's. And when we got over there, we started spying all around the wall to see This horse was white, but not entirely, with spots and strokes on it, as if a painter had flicked his brush with black and dark greys over the paper. A girl on top of him took off her red Indian bonnet and got the horse to bow down to a mat she'd laid on O'Leary's gravel. There was no saddle that I could see, but a blanket and furs. She had cowboy boots and leggings, and held in one hand a silver-topped cane or riding whip. Her top was nothing to it and sparkly. That would be the circus, said Pod. But we'd all got that a mile before Pod, who's not the fastest. I'm asking my man for a ticket, he says. But what would we be doing that for with our money? We'd seen the best of it. The beautiful girl, the horse as big as a house, kneeling down for her and for us because of what her legs had said to it, and her being one and the same with that magnificent beast.
Well done, Peter, on your Irish accent there for the poem.
Very convincing, I must say. No, I wouldn't dream of coming here to Ireland and doing a cod Irish accent. But it was lovely to hear the poem in that voice. Caroline Gerbola, who is a vibrant, wonderful young circus performer on this pied pony, is now a woman in her 60s. And through the photographer, I'm in touch with her, and I'm sending her a copy of the book. And that's the kind of human connection that I value. It's the innocence of the boys. What do we look for when we go to a circus? We look to escape. But what's wonderful about the photograph is it's not in the circus. It's in a back lane where she's just putting the horse through its moves. And the boys kind of work out what's going on. And in a sense, it's a performance just for them. They're the uninvited audience for this performance. And it's very special for that reason.
America features largely in this book as well, and it's clearly a place that nourishes your imagination. We were just wondering, could you now read for us in your inimitable voice your poem Railroad, which is set there? We'd love to hear it.
Yeah, the reason for that was that back in 79-81, I went to Goddard College, Vermont, and did an MFA. I won't tell you what my colleagues thought MFA stood for, but it actually stands for Master of Fine Arts. So I was actually the only person officially qualified to teach creative writing in Britain, which I turned to my advantage at the university, obviously. So America, yes, it's been very important. And this is possibly our last trip to America. I won't go there with Trump even possibly in charge of anything. And it's taking a train between Philadelphia and New York, railroad. Between Philadelphia and Penn Station, New York City, the black conductor and I bond for half an hour maybe, longer than both fights took, over memories of Cassius Clay, shaking Liston and the watching world. First, the wrenched shoulder in Miami, with Liston quitting on his stool. And then the KO in Maine, except no one saw that punch. It eluded cameras and reporters. The mob fixed it. Crazy odds, 7-1. Sonny died in Vegas, a needle in his arm. Who knows the whole story? Who cares now? The gruesome Sonny Liston, America's Negro nightmare, felled like a bull. Clay was booed all the way to the ring, his slave name ringing out still, but left it as a champion called Ali, bringing us together decades on. This train goes underground, beneath the Hudson River, under the skyscrapers, unseen into the heart of the city. Madison Square Garden, blood and dreams. Everything we need, it seems.
Very interesting, Tony. Just still on the American theme. I mean, the title poem is it's Leaving the Hills, and it's all about it's in the voice of Aldous Huxley, and it's all about him leaving his house as a wildfire rages around him. Could you just tell us a little bit about that incident?
It's historical in the sense that it's a wildfire from the early 60s in Bel Air in California, where lots of famous and rich people lived. But of course, it's very contemporary because there are wildfires all over this messed up world of ours. And Huxley, it's that old thing, if you're on if you're on the sinking ship, what do you throw in the lifeboat? And if there's a wildfire running through your canyon, what do you throw in the car? What do you save? and most things he can't save. A Friend's Blade from Balliol, Christopher Isherwood's signed copy of Goodbye to Berlin, Auden's poems. These are things that burn in the fire. And I thought this is a great metaphor, again, for someone of my age. At the end of a life that's packed with things, what do you save? And writing the poems is, in a way, saving things from a life.
Exactly. The other thing that's in the book, I mean, you're going to read for us. I mean, it's a poem from a sequence called Aberfan Voices, and you wrote this in 2016 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the disaster. And I wonder, just for people here who mightn't know about that, could you first of all maybe just explain what happened in that disaster?
Well, I'd be amazed if people don't remember it, because it was something that captured the imagination and the heartstrings of the world. In 1966, a slag heap, a heap of waste in a Welsh valley south of Merthyr Tydfil, in a little village called Aberfan, undistinguished really village, came down and killed over 100 school children and their teachers. And the thing is, probably everyone was guilty there. The coal board, the miners, the politicians, everybody knew these things were unsafe. And they just turned their backs on it, really. And it was a horror, a tragedy that went round the world. 50 years later, a fellow Welsh language poet and I, Graham Davis and I, were encouraged to memorialize this. And so we both did sequences. Graham has a book out at the same time as mine, and his sequence is in his book. And mine is here, accompanied again by photographs by the American photographer Chuck Rappaport, who, learning of this, went to the New York Times editor and said, "Look, I'm going to do Aberfan and take some photographs." And the guy said, he said, "That was months ago. It's over." And he said, "No, I want to go back and see what's happening 2 months later, after the initial shock and trauma of the tragedy. What's it like now?" And he took these amazing photographs, 6 of which are in my book with accompanying poems. I'll read the poem Where I Was, which is underneath almost a generic black and white photograph of a miner with his lamp. Where I was. Where were you when the old king died? Walking to the pithead with my buddies. Where were you for the peace in our time? In the parlour with Delith and our mother's new wireless. Where were you when the bombers came? Holding the hand of a Bevin boy in the shivering dark. Where were you when the war ended? In the bath before our fire, hearing the church bells. Where were you for the coronation? A mile underneath her kingdom. Where were you when they put the dog in space? Down here. What about the missiles in Cuba? We was well out of reach in the Merthyr Vale, already buried. Where were you when the president was shot? Checking the lamp and opening my snap. And where were you when you heard about Aberfan? Mid-shift, working at the face, blinded with dust that the tears began to wash and the mandrel dropped as my fists clenched and I heard the distant howls of men. That poem, in a sense, and it's a difficult poem to read, I'm a history poet, really. I don't write so much about myself, my smug middle-aged, middle-class life. But that poem pulls together some of the important moments of the 20th century. I'm still, I guess, out of my time. I'm a 20th century poet. Where were you when the president died? Where were you for the coronation? Those guys were underground, already buried. So that's an important poem, and thank you for letting me read that.
It's a powerful piece, Tony.
Thank you to Tony Curtis. Tony was reading Where I Was. It was actually read as part of the Welsh Senate's Day of Remembrance as well. And it features in his new collection from Sirr called Leaving the Hills. And Tony, we really hope that you enjoyed the Strokestown Festival, and thank you for coming to the breakfast table today with us.
It's my pleasure. I should say I came to Strokestown over 20 years ago as one of the shortlisted poets. I knew the judge this year with my colleague Sheena Pugh. We didn't win, but it didn't matter because we had such a marvellous time. Lovely to come back to Strokestown. Thank you.
And thanks to all the contributors on today's episode of Books for Breakfast. We were talking about the Strokestown International Poetry Festival, which takes place this May Bank Holiday weekend from Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 5th of May. Do come along. I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.